The paper trembled in Luke Walden's hands. He had read surveying reports before, dozens of them, maybe hundreds over the 16 years he had worked this land, bled on this land, buried his father in this land. He knew every creek bend, every rocky outcropping, every fence post. He had driven himself into the Colorado soil with his own 2 fists. He knew the Walden Ranch the way he knew his own face in a mirror. But the document Susan Wilcox had just laid across his kitchen table told a different story entirely. The room went very quiet. Outside, the late August wind pushed through the cottonwood trees, and the leaves made a sound like whispered secrets. Susan stood across the table from him, her jaw set hard, her dark eyes watching his face with an expression that mixed grief with something that looked almost like apology. She was still in her traveling clothes, a gray wool dress dusty from 2 days on the road, her dark hair pinned up but loosened at the temples from the heat of the journey. Her son, 8-year-old Danny, sat on the porch outside with a tin cup of water, pretending not to listen through the open window. Luke could hear his own breathing. The surveyor's stamp at the bottom of the document was dated May 3rd, 1882. The name printed in the top right corner of the official Colorado Territorial Survey document was not Luke Walden. It was not the Walden Family Trust. The name, printed in bold black ink, in the handwriting of a government surveyor who had apparently done his job with meticulous care, was that of Harold Wilcox, deceased, late of Denver, formerly of the Colorado Territorial Land Commission, Susan's dead husband. "You need to understand," Susan said, and her voice was quiet and controlled in the way of a woman who had practiced this moment, rehearsed it perhaps for weeks, "that I am not here to take anything from you." Luke looked up from the paper. The color had drained from his face. He could feel it, the blood retreating from his skin the way water retreats before a flood. His ranch, his family's land. 4,000 acres of the most productive cattle ground in the San Juan Valley, land that had shaped every choice he had ever made, land that had kept him here when he might have gone somewhere easier, somewhere that did not demand everything from a man and then ask for more. He set the document down very carefully on the table, the way a man sets down a loaded rifle. "Then what," he said, "are you here for?" That question had not been asked 3 weeks earlier when Susan had first seen the document that would change both their lives. She had been in the small law office of Marcus Webb, a Denver attorney with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, settling the affairs of her late husband Harold Wilcox, who had died of pneumonia in February of 1882, leaving her with a modest house in Denver, a modest debt from his land speculation years, and a son named Danny who had his father's ears and his mother's stubbornness. Marcus Webb had placed the surveyor's report on his desk and said, "Mrs. Wilcox, I am going to need you to read this very carefully." She had read it. She had read it 3 times. Then she had sat in the wooden chair across from Marcus Webb with her hands folded in her lap and asked him, with the precision of a woman who had survived enough to know that precision mattered, what it meant. What it meant, Marcus explained, was that Harold Wilcox, in his capacity as a junior surveyor for the Colorado Territorial Land Commission in 1874, had filed an official claim survey on a parcel of land in the San Juan Valley. He had filed the claim in his own name, which was technically permissible under certain territorial provisions at the time. He had then, for reasons unknown, never acted on that claim, never sold it, never developed it, never transferred it. He had simply left it in the territorial record and gone on with his life. The parcel was 4,211 acres. It was the Walden Ranch. Susan had sat in that chair for a very long time. The Walden family, Marcus explained gently, had been working that land since 1866, when Luke Walden's father, a man named Caleb Walden, had staked his own claim under a different survey and built his first structure on the property. The problem was that Harold's Territorial Commission survey, which predated the Walden filing by several months under a technicality in the Commission's mapping authority, had never been properly voided or superseded. It existed in a legal limbo that a skilled territorial land attorney could potentially use to argue prior claim. "Are you telling me," Susan had said slowly, "that my late husband, a man I knew for 12 years, quietly held a legal claim over another family's ranch that he never told me about or exercised?" Marcus Webb had folded his hands on the desk. "I am telling you that the document exists and that it has legal weight. What you choose to do with that information is entirely your decision, Mrs. Wilcox." What Susan Wilcox chose to do was none of the things that Marcus Webb had perhaps expected. She did not hire an aggressive attorney. She did not file a territorial challenge. She did not sell the claim to a land speculator, of which Denver in 1882 had no shortage, men with deep pockets and shallow consciences who would have paid her handsomely for that document, and then descended on the Walden ranch like locusts. What she did was pack a bag, arrange for her neighbor Mrs. Carmichael to water her houseplants, collect her son Danny from school 3 days early, and hire a wagon to take her south toward the San Juan Valley. She needed to look the man in the eye first. She needed to understand who he was before she decided what to do. That had been her reasoning, clean and simple and entirely logical. She told herself that on the 2-day journey south, watching the Colorado landscape open up from the tight streets of Denver into something vast and ancient and indifferent. She told herself that when Danny fell asleep against her shoulder with his mouth slightly open and his small fists curled in his lap. She told herself that when the wagon driver, a taciturn man named Pete Hollies, pointed toward a valley opening between 2 ridgelines and said, "That down there is Walden land." All of it far as you can see, she had looked at it then. All 4,000 acres of it spread out below them in the late afternoon light, golden and green and alive with the movement of cattle in the distance, and she had felt something she had not expected to feel. She had felt the weight of what a man could love. She arrived at the Walden Ranch house in the early evening of August 18th, 1882, driving the wagon herself after Pete Hollies had let her off at the Valley Road with his payment and his silence. The house was larger than she had imagined, a 2-story structure built from local sandstone with a broad front porch and a separate bunkhouse to the east, a barn, corrals, a kitchen garden. The entire operation had the settled, permanent look of something that had been fought for and maintained over many years with concentrated intention. Luke Walden had come out of the barn when he heard the wagon. She had not known what she expected. She had imagined, perhaps, an older man, someone weathered and remote, the kind of hardened rancher who existed at a comfortable distance from sentiment. What she got was a man who was 34 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had never stopped working with his hands, with dark hair that had gone slightly too long and gray eyes that caught the evening light and held it. He had looked at her wagon, at her, at Danny sitting beside her, and his expression had shifted through confusion and wariness and something cautious that she did not quite have a name for yet. "Can I help you?" he had said. She had told him who she was and asked if she might water her horse. He had taken the horse himself without comment and led it to the trough, then come back and told her she was welcome to come inside while the horse rested. He had made coffee without being asked, found a piece of salt bread for Danny, and sat down across from her with the patient expression of a man who was waiting to understand the shape of a problem before he tried to solve it. She had liked that about him immediately and had told herself not to. She had talked around the real reason for almost 20 minutes. She had asked about the valley, about the cattle operation, about how long the ranch had been in his family. He had answered each question simply and without embellishment. His father had come in 1866. He had died in 1876. His mother had gone back east in 1878. Luke had run the place himself since then with a crew of 4 hands whose names he gave her without being asked, as though he understood that she was measuring the human dimension of this place along with the physical one. Then she had put the document on the table. She had watched his face. She had watched Luke Walden's face very carefully as he read it, and she had seen what she needed to see. She had seen that this was not a man who had known, that there was no hidden motive, no dark past arrangement between Harold and the Walden family, no conspiracy. There was just a dead man's careless legacy and a living man who had just learned that the ground beneath his boots might belong to someone else. "Then what are you here for?" Luke asked. "To return it to you," Susan said. The silence that followed was one of the strangest she had ever inhabited. Luke stared at her across the kitchen table with those gray eyes, and she could see him processing her words the way a man processes something that does not fit the category of thing he was prepared for. "You came all the way from Denver," he said slowly, "with your son, to give me back land you have a legal claim to. I came to give you the original document, and to sign whatever a lawyer tells me I need to sign to make sure that claim is properly voided. It was not Harold's to keep, and it is not mine. Your family has been on this land for 16 years. Your husband did not know you very well," Luke said, and it came out before he clearly intended it because he looked briefly startled by his own words. "I mean, a man who would keep something like this without telling his wife." "Harold had many compartments," Susan said. "I understood some of them better than others." Danny appeared in the doorway from the porch, looking between the two adults with the frank curiosity of a child who has learned that adult conversations frequently contain important information. "Are we staying or going?" he asked. Luke looked at the boy. Something in his expression shifted again, just slightly, toward something softer. "You are staying for supper," he said, "if your mother will allow it." Susan looked at Luke Walden sitting across her late husband's surveying report at a kitchen table in a stone house that the report technically said belonged to her, and she understood with sudden clarity that she had not actually expected to like this man. She had expected the situation to be clean, arrive, present the document, arrange the legal formalities, leave. She had not expected the coffee, or the salt bread for Danny, or the way he had said your family has been on this land for 16 years, as though the history of a thing was sufficient argument for its moral weight. "We will stay for supper," she said. The bunkhouse cook, a thick-armed Mexican man named Ernesto, whom the hands all called Ern, produced a meal of venison stew and cornbread that was substantially better than anything Susan had cooked in the past month. She ate with genuine appetite, which surprised her. Danny ate 2 servings and then asked Luke with complete transparency whether the large brown horse in the second corral was his. "That is Jasper," Luke said. "He is mine. He is also 16 years old and has strong opinions about most things." "I have a horse," Danny said. "He is in Denver. His name is General. That is a good name for a horse. My father gave it to him. My father is dead." There was a pause at the table that had a particular kind of weight to it, the kind that descends when a child says a true and irreversible thing in a simple voice. Luke looked at Danny with an expression that held something beyond mere politeness. "I am sorry to hear that," he said. "I lost my father too. It is a hard thing." Danny nodded with the serious gravity of someone who has already arrived at the same conclusion through his own experience. Then he asked if he could go look at Jasper, and Luke sent one of the ranch hands, a young man named Colt with a pleasant face and a gift for talking to children, to accompany him. Susan and Luke sat at the table alone, with the remains of supper between them, and Harold's Surveyors report still on the corner of the table like a third presence that neither of them quite wanted to acknowledge directly. "Tell me about Harold," Luke said. She had not expected that either. She had expected legal strategy, or gratitude, or some version of the careful politeness people used when the situation was too complicated for ordinary manners. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you think I should," Luke said. "He touched this land without ever setting foot on it and then died without telling you. I would like to understand the kind of man that was." Susan was quiet for a moment. Outside she could hear Danny's voice and then Colt's lower one, and the sound of Jasper blowing air through his nose in the corral. "Harold was a man who was very good at beginning things," she said. "He began a land commission career and it led nowhere. He began a surveying firm and it lasted 2 years. He began a hardware investment in Kansas City that consumed most of our savings. Every beginning was genuine. He was genuinely enthusiastic, genuinely convinced. He was not a dishonest man in the way of someone who intends harm. He was dishonest the way some people are careless, not with malice but with a kind of persistent inattention to consequences. "He loved you?" Luke asked. The question was direct but not intrusive, the way certain direct questions manage to be. "In his way," Susan said. "In the way a man loves the life he chose when that life is comfortable. He would not have chosen differently, but neither would he have rearranged his habits for it." She paused. "I loved him more carefully than he loved me. That is not a complaint. It is simply the arithmetic of how it was." Luke looked at the table. "I have not been very good at beginning things with people," he said. "This ranch has been the beginning and middle and end of most of my attention for a long time, and you are not sorry for that." "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes I look at this place in the evening, and it is the most complete thing I have ever seen, and I think there is nothing else required. And then sometimes I walk through this house, and the quiet of it is a different kind of thing entirely." Susan understood that distinction. She had lived in it since February. The evening settled into something she had not planned and could not entirely explain, a slow, careful conversation that moved through the practical, and then, gradually and without announcement, into territory that was less practical and more essential. They talked about the valley in winter, which Luke described with a kind of reverent attention she found unexpectedly moving. They talked about Denver, which she described without nostalgia, but with the honest acknowledgement that it was the only life she knew. They talked about Danny, and about what it meant to raise a child on the frontier versus in a city, and about what children needed from their surroundings in order to become the people they were supposed to become. She did not notice how late it had gotten until Colt brought Danny back in already half asleep, the boy leaning against the hand's arm with his eyes drooping and his hair wild from an evening in the wind. "He fell asleep on the fence rail watching the horses," Colt reported with a grin. "Caught him before he could fall." Luke stood from the table. "You should both stay the night. It is too dark to drive the wagon road safely, and you came a long distance today. I would not want to impose." "You have just handed me back 4,000 acres," Luke said simply. "The least I can do is give you a spare room." She stayed. Danny was settled onto a cot in the small room off the kitchen without fully waking up, and Susan was shown to a proper guest room on the upper floor with a window that looked out toward the western ridgeline, where the stars were very large and very numerous in the way they were in high country. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while and listened to the quiet of the ranch at night, which was not the quiet of Denver at all, not the muffled urban quiet of wood walls and cobblestone streets and neighbors pressing against each other in the darkness. This was open quiet, the kind with texture and dimension, the sound of an enormous space at rest. She did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, Luke made breakfast before she came downstairs. Danny was already up and on the porch with a piece of cornbread and an expression of complete contentment, having apparently decided that this ranch was one of the better places he had encountered in his 8 years of experience. Luke was at the stove in the early light, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched him without announcing herself, struck by some quality of the scene that she could not immediately name. It was the ease of it, she decided. There was no performance in the way this man moved through his own kitchen in the morning, no role being played, just a person being entirely present in the ordinary act of feeding himself and his guests. "I can see you," Luke said without turning around. "You have been standing there for about 30 seconds. "I was thinking," Susan said, "about the legal situation." "No," she said, "not about that." He turned then and looked at her across the kitchen with a kind of direct attention that was different from the careful politeness of the night before. It was more considered, more deliberate. "Stay another day," he said. Susan opened her mouth to refuse. She had the objections ready, the journey home, the houseplants at Mrs. Carmichael's, the attorneys to contact. But something happened between the intention and the words, some interruption that she would think about later and not be entirely able to explain. "One day," she said. One day became 3. She could document how it happened if she had to, trace the progression through the logic of small practical things. There were the legal conversations that needed to occur, letters to be drafted to Marcus Webb in Denver, with instructions to prepare the paperwork for the formal voiding of Harold's territorial claim. Luke's ranch foreman, a serious-faced man named Bill Garrett who had been with the Walden Ranch for 9 years, had opinions about the legal process that required discussion. There were reasons to stay, sensible reasons, reasons that anyone would have accepted without suspicion. But the reasons were not entirely why she stayed. On the second day, Luke showed her the valley from the upper pasture in the morning when the light came in from the east and turned everything amber and slow. He did not make a show of it, did not gesture broadly at the view with proprietorial pride the way she might have expected. He simply walked beside her through the high grass and talked about the land the way someone talks about a person they know very well, with attention to the particular, with recognition of flaws alongside virtues, with the ease of long familiarity. He showed her where the creek ran cold even in August because of the spring feed from the ridge. He showed her the cottonwood grove where his father had built the first structure, a single-room cabin that was gone now, replaced by the stone house, but the trees remained. "He planted 3 of those himself," Luke said, looking at the cottonwoods. "My father, he said a man should always plant something that will outlive him." Susan looked at the trees. They were tall and well-established, their leaves catching the morning air. "Did you plant anything?" she asked. "The kitchen garden," Luke said, "every spring, and I planted the windbreak on the north side in 1878. He paused. "I suppose that counts." "I think it counts." They walked back in a silence that was comfortable in the way of silences between people who do not need to perform for each other. Susan noticed this. She filed it in the category of things about this man that she had not expected and that were proving difficult to assign a proper emotional distance. On the second afternoon, Danny asked Luke if he could learn to rope. Luke produced a small lasso of soft hemp rope from the barn without fanfare, tied it appropriately for a child's hands, and spent the better part of 2 hours in the corral with Danny, an fence post substitute target, teaching the boy the mechanics of a loop and throw with a patience that was not theatrical but simply unending. Danny progressed from total incompetence to moderate incompetence over the course of the lesson, and when he finally dropped the loop cleanly over the fence post, he produced a shout of triumph that startled the horses in the adjacent corral. Susan watched from the fence rail and felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, something that scared her a little with its particular quality of wanting. On the third morning, she found the dark past. She had not been snooping. She had been looking for extra paper in the study off the main room, wanting to write a letter to Marcus Webb before the afternoon. The study was orderly but not formal, a working room with surveying maps pinned to one wall and cattle ledgers stacked on the desk beside a coffee cup with a faded chip in its handle. She had found the paper she needed in the top desk drawer and was closing it when the photograph slipped out from under the blotter and fell to the floor. She picked it up. It was a daguerreotype, the formal studio kind, a young couple in their wedding clothes. The man was Luke, unmistakably Luke although younger, perhaps 23 or 24, in a dark suit, and a stiff expression that was fighting with something that wanted to be a smile and not quite winning. The woman beside him was dark-haired and fine-featured, and wore an expression of complete happiness. Susan stood in the study with the photograph and felt the particular cold that comes with discovering a secret you did not know to look for. Luke came into the study doorway and stopped when he saw her holding the photograph. There was a moment between them that had no adequate language. "Her name was Clara," he said. His voice was entirely level, but there was something underneath the level that she could hear clearly. "She died in 1879, fever." "I am sorry," Susan said, and she meant it fully. She placed the photograph carefully on the desk. I was not trying to find things. I know. He came into the room and picked up the photograph and set it back under the blotter with a gesture that was neither hurried nor rough, just deliberate. I do not show people that because they always want to make it into the explanation for everything about me, as though a man is simply the sum of what he has lost. You are more than that. So are you, he said. He looked at her, then with the same direct attention she was learning to recognize as his specific way of seeing, not aggressive but thorough, as though he wanted to make sure he was understanding the actual person, and not a version he had constructed from his own assumptions. You have held your husband's paper in your hands and made a decision about who you are rather than what it entitled you to. That is not grief talking. That is character. Susan held his gaze. I should finish the letter to Marcus Webb. You should, he agreed. Neither of them moved for another few seconds. Then she sat down at the desk and began writing the letter, and Luke left the study, and the moment concluded with the quiet efficiency of things that are put carefully aside for later. She sent the letter with a rider that afternoon. Marcus Webb would receive it within 2 days and begin the legal work of formally voiding Harold's territorial claim in favor of the existing Walden title. The process, Marcus had explained in Denver, would take several weeks to complete through the Territorial Land Office in Denver, but it would be complete. The document Susan had brought from Denver would be rendered legally inert. Luke's ranch would be Luke's ranch without question. She told Luke this at supper on the 3rd evening, the details of the legal process, the timeline, the various signatures and filings that would be required of him in Denver at some point within the next few weeks. He listened with the attention he gave to everything important, asking 2 or 3 precise questions and then sitting quietly with the information. You will need to go to Denver yourself, she said. To sign the voiding documents at the land office, Marcus will arrange it. I can do that, Luke said. It would make sense, Susan said carefully, if I returned home before then. The process does not require my presence in the valley, only the initial instructions to Marcus and then the Denver office appointment for you. It would make practical sense, Luke said. Yes. The word practical sat between them on the table like a stone dropped in water. Danny was already in bed. The ranch was quiet around them, in its characteristic deep nighttime way. A candle was burning on the table between them, and it made the kitchen feel smaller and warmer than it was, which was a trick that candlelight had been playing on people for as long as there had been people and candles. I do not want you to go yet, Luke said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without dramatic preparation, as though complicated truths were best delivered plainly. And because it was plain, because it did not try to be more than it was, Susan found she could not manufacture a polite deflection for it. Polite deflection required the other person to have said something cloaked or oblique. Luke was incapable of oblique. I have only been here 3 days, she said. I know. This is a very particular situation. The document, the history of it, the reason I came. It would be easy to mistake the intensity of the circumstances for something else. I am not mistaking anything, Luke said. I am telling you what is true. What you choose to do with it is your determination to make. Susan looked at the candle flame for a long moment. I will stay 2 more days, she said. And then I need to go home and attend to things properly. 2 days, Luke said. All right. On the 4th day, they rode the North Range together on horseback. Susan had been on horseback infrequently since leaving her parents' Indiana farm at 18 for city life, but the skills had not entirely abandoned her, and the horse Luke saddled for her, a calm roan mare named Pearl, was accommodating of rustiness. Danny rode double with Colt on a broad-backed bay and produced a running commentary on everything he saw that kept the ranch hand occupied with tolerant answers the entire morning. Luke rode beside Susan at a pace that let them talk easily, and they talked about everything with the particular freedom that open space and motion together create in people who have begun to trust each other. She told him about her childhood in Indiana, her farmer father and her schoolteacher mother, the 5 siblings she rarely saw now. He told her about learning the cattle business from his father at 14, working the seasons until the ranching logic was as natural to him as breathing. She told him that she had wanted to be a schoolteacher herself, until Harold Wilcox arrived at a church social in Denver in 1869 with a charming smile and plans for a surveying career. He told her that Clara had taught him how to bake bread the summer before she died, and that he still baked it sometimes on winter Sundays when the ranch was quiet. "A rancher who bakes bread," Susan said. "The hands think it is eccentric," Luke said. "Ern is privately offended by it." "I think it is not eccentric at all," she said. "I think it is a man who paid attention to someone he loved and did not put down what she gave him." Luke was quiet for a moment, looking at the land ahead of them. "I have not spoken about Clara that easily in 3 years," he said. "She sounds like someone who deserved more than 3 years of difficult speaking." He looked at her with an expression that she thought might be the closest he came to being disarmed. "Yes," he said, "she was." They rode in comfortable silence for a while after that, the horses moving through the late summer grass at an easy walk, the valley spreading out around them in its enormous unconcerned beauty. Susan thought about Indiana, about Harold, about the small Denver house where she had sat alone since February. She thought about Danny's contentment on this ranch, the way the boy had expanded into the space of it like a plant given real sunlight after a long winter on a windowsill. She thought about what it would mean to leave. On the 5th day, the last day she had allowed herself, something happened that neither of them had planned. It began with the unwelcome arrival of 2 men on horseback in the late morning, hard-looking men, with the deliberate manner of people who have rehearsed their purpose. Their names, as they introduced themselves with cold courtesy on the Walden porch, were Silas Crane and Tom Lear, and they represented a Denver land speculation company called the Continental Holdings Group. Susan went cold when they mentioned it. Continental Holdings was exactly the kind of company that Marcus Webb had warned her about, the kind that would have paid her handsomely for Harold's document, and then used it as a lever against the Walden ranch. The taller man, Crane, produced a document from his coat pocket. "Mrs. Wilcox," he said, with a smile that had no warmth in it at all, "we have reason to believe you are in possession of a Colorado territorial survey document that our company has a significant interest in acquiring." Luke had come out of the barn when he heard the riders approach and was now standing at the foot of the porch steps, one hand resting on the rail, watching with an expression that was entirely still. "How did you know where to find me?" Susan asked. "Mr. Webb's office has a secretary," Crane said simply. "We are prepared to offer you a very generous compensation for the document and for a transfer of the territorial claim it represents." "The document has already been submitted to my attorney for formal voiding," Susan said. Crane's smile did not change. "That process is not yet complete. The claim still legally exists until it is voided by the land office. We would argue that you have not yet been adequately compensated for your interest, and that a widow in your financial position—" "That is enough," Luke said. His voice was quiet. The quietness of it was more significant than volume would have been. He came up the porch steps and stood beside Susan in a way that was not territorial or aggressive, but simply clear. "The lady has told you the document is being voided. This ranch is not for sale, and it is not subject to speculation. You can head back the way you came." Crane looked at Luke with the calculating assessment of a man who is trying to determine whether the obstacle in front of him is serious. Apparently Luke's expression provided an adequate answer, because after a moment Crane put the document back in his pocket. "This is not the last of it," Crane said. "Continental Holdings does not give up on legitimate legal opportunities easily." "It is not a legitimate legal opportunity," Susan said. "It is an oversight that is being corrected. I suggest you find another parcel to speculate on." The 2 men rode out without another word. Susan watched them go until they crested the ridge and disappeared, and then let out a breath she had not noticed she was holding. "They will try again," Luke said beside her. "Yes, But the legal process Marcus is working on should close the window before they can do anything actionable. Once the claim is formally voided at the land office, there is nothing to purchase. You were very calm, Luke said. I have had practice managing men who think that the word widow is synonymous with the word vulnerable, Susan said. Luke looked at her for a long moment. You are the least vulnerable person I have met in a very long time, he said. It was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was an observation, stated with the same quality of careful accuracy he applied to everything. It landed differently because of that. That is either a very kind thing to say or a very unsettling one, she said. Perhaps both, Luke said. The incident with Crane and Lear had done something to the day that Susan could not reverse. It had clarified what was at stake. Not abstractly, in the way she had understood it intellectually since sitting in Marcus Webb's office, but concretely, in the physical way you understand a threat when it walks up your porch steps with a cold smile. This land, this ranch, this life that Luke Walden had built over 16 years, it was fragile in the way all things built on legal paperwork were fragile. The document Susan held was genuinely dangerous in the wrong hands, and the men who had just ridden away were evidence that those wrong hands were close. She spent the afternoon writing a second and much more urgent letter to Marcus Webb, detailing the Continental Holdings visit and asking him to accelerate the legal voiding process by whatever means were available. She wrote it at Luke's desk with focused efficiency, Luke sitting across the room reading a cattle ledger, neither of them speaking much but occupying the same space in a way that felt natural. Danny was asleep by 8. By 9, the hands had retired to the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet in its deep nighttime way. Susan brought out the original survey document from her traveling bag and placed it on the kitchen table. She and Luke looked at it together. When this is voided, she said, I want you to have the original, not just the legal void, the paper itself, so there is no question about what became of it. You came a long way to do a very decent thing, Luke said. I came because I needed to know who you were, Susan said, before I decided what to do with it. And what did you find? She had been asking herself that for 5 days. The answers had accumulated like water in a vessel, small additions each day, until the weight of them was undeniable. She had found a man who was quiet in the most productive sense of quiet. She had found someone who listened with his whole attention and spoke without decoration. She had found patience and humor, and the particular depth that came from a person who had survived loss without letting it make them smaller. She had found someone who had given Danny 2 hours with a rope on a fence post and never once made the boy feel like an inconvenience. She had found, to her own significant inconvenience, that she was falling in love with him. I found someone I was not expecting, she said. The moment that followed was one of those moments that both participants understand without needing to negotiate. Luke reached across the table and took her hand, which was resting on the document, and held it with a careful certainty that was entirely consistent with everything she had learned about him in 5 days. It was not impulsive. It was not performed. It was a man who had decided something and acted on the decision with complete commitment. I do not want you to leave tomorrow, he said. I need to go, she said softly. I have to handle things in Denver, the legal process, the house, Danny's school. I know, he said. I know those are real things. His thumb moved slightly against the back of her hand. But I want you to come back. Luke, I am not asking for a promise, he said. I am asking for honesty. Is there a reason not to come back? Susan thought about the Denver house, which had never felt entirely like hers. She thought about the quiet of it, which was the wrong kind of quiet. She thought about Danny on the fence rail with his face turned toward the mountains and his expression of absolute peace. No, she said quietly. There is no reason not to come back. He did not kiss her that night. She noticed this and thought about it on the journey home, which was 2 days north toward Denver with Danny asleep beside her, and the landscape retreating from the openness of the valley back toward the compressed energy of the city. He had not kissed her, and she understood why. in the way she was learning to understand how Luke Walden made decisions. He would not move past the threshold of what was clear and honest. He had told her the truth of what he wanted. He had heard the truth of her response. That was the beginning of something, not the thing itself, and he was apparently capable of holding that distinction with patience. She was not entirely sure she had that kind of patience, but she found herself respecting it profoundly. Denver received her with its normal noise and weight. The house was fine. Mrs. Carmichael had watered the plants and left a cold pie on the table, a kindness that made Susan unexpectedly tearful after the long journey. She enrolled Danny back in school on Monday, visited Marcus Webb on Tuesday, and spent the better part of 2 hours with him going through the accelerated voiding process for Harold's territorial claim. Marcus listened to her account of the Continental Holdings visit with an expression of professional concern. "They will try to establish contact with you directly in Denver," he said. "I recommend you not meet with them or respond to any communication without me present." "I have no intention of selling to them," Susan said. "I know that," Marcus said. "But they may attempt to manufacture legal ambiguity about your intentions if they can document any communication that sounds like negotiation. Silence is your best protection until the voiding is filed." "How long?" 3 weeks, perhaps a month. "There is a backlog at the Territorial Land Office, but I know the registrar and I can press." Marcus looked at her over his spectacles with the mild candor of a man who has been observing people negotiate difficult situations for many years. "You seem different, Mrs. Wilcox." "I had a long trip," she said. "Yes," Marcus said, with a slight smile that managed to communicate a great deal more than the word suggested. "I imagined so." The weeks that followed were the strangest, and in some ways the richest of Susan's life, full as they were with the simultaneous experience of ordinary Denver life and the constant undercurrent of something that was changing everything. She managed Danny's school and the household accounts and the modest monthly payment from Harold's surveying firm settlement. She corresponded with Marcus about the legal process. She planted the last of the autumn bulbs in the small front garden, and she wrote letters to Luke Walden. The first one was practical, a report on the legal process and the Continental Holdings situation and Marcus's progress. The second one was mostly practical, with a brief paragraph about Danny's school performance and a sentence about the weather that was not really about the weather. By the third letter she had given up the pretense of practicality and simply wrote the way she had talked on that long ride through the North Pasture, openly and without armor, about whatever was true. Luke's letters came back within 5 or 6 days, written in the slightly formal hand of someone who was not a natural correspondent but was making a genuine effort. He wrote about the ranch, the cattle count, the October cold coming down from the mountains. He wrote about a problem with the north fence line that had taken a week to fix. He wrote about baking bread on a Sunday when the first snow came, and the hands acting as though this were perfectly ordinary. He wrote, at the end of the fourth letter, a single line that she read 3 times before she folded the paper and put it back in its envelope. The line was, "There is a light in this house in the evenings that seems like it ought to belong to more than one person." She sat with that line for the rest of the evening with a cup of tea cooling in her hands and the Denver street noise outside, and she thought about Harold's compartments and about Clara's cottonwood trees, about the 4,000 acres that had been the shape of a secret for 8 years, about Danny dropping a rope loop over a fence post and shouting with joy, about the surveying report that had started all of it with its innocent bureaucratic precision. She thought, here is a person I could share a life with. She thought, here is a person I might be genuinely good for. She thought, here is a person who, for the first time in my life, I believe would be genuinely good for me. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb filed the formal voiding of Harold's territorial claim with the Colorado Territorial Land Office. The same week, Continental Holdings attempted to file an injunction to halt the voiding process on the grounds that the claim holder, Susan Wilcox, had not been adequately advised of the claim's commercial value prior to the voiding election. Marcus dealt with this efficiently. He had, with Susan's permission and foresight, documented every step of her decision-making process since his initial meeting with her in February, including written records of her stated intentions, and the fact that she had been fully informed of the document's potential commercial value by a qualified attorney prior to making her decision. The injunction was denied within 48 hours. Continental Holdings sent Sela's crane to Susan's house on a Tuesday morning. She opened the door, saw who it was, said, "I am not in negotiation with your company, and any further contact should be directed to my attorney, Marcus Webb," and closed the door. Then she stood in the hallway for a moment to let her heartbeat settle and felt something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. And then she felt, very clearly, the desire to be somewhere that was not this small Denver house with its wrong kind of quiet. She wrote Luke a letter that afternoon. It was not a practical letter. It was not about the legal situation. It was a letter in which she said what she had been working towards saying for 3 weeks, said it plainly and without decoration, the way she had learned to say things from watching a man who believed in the honesty of plain speech. She said, "I want to come back, not for the legal paperwork and not for a visit. I want to come back because I believe we are building something and I would like to build it in the same location." She sent it with the afternoon post and then took Danny to the park on 17th Street and watched him chase the autumn leaves in the wind and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had just done, which was terrifying and necessary and right. Luke's response arrived in 4 days. It was the longest letter he had written her. He told her that he had repaired the porch steps and the guest room window latch. He told her that Ernesto had mentioned, unprompted, and with the subtlety of a man dropping a horseshoe on a stone floor, that the kitchen could benefit from certain organizational improvements that he personally lacked the inclination to implement. He told her that Danny was welcome in the school that the neighboring ranching families ran cooperatively with a teacher who came out from Durango, if Danny was willing, and that the school had a good reputation among the families who used it. And at the end of the letter he wrote, "Come home," 2 words, completely ordinary. She cried reading them, briefly and without embarrassment, alone in the kitchen with the afternoon light on the table. She began to organize. The Denver house, she learned from a careful accounting of her situation, could be sold. The proceeds plus Harold's modest insurance settlement gave her a financial standing that was not wealthy but was competent. She was not coming to Luke without means, which was important to her, not for pride's sake exactly, but because she wanted to arrive as herself, a complete person with her own resources, not as a woman who needed rescuing from her circumstances. Marcus Webb handled the house sale with his customary efficiency and had completed the transaction within 3 weeks, which Susan interpreted as the universe being cooperative for once. She allowed Danny to understand what was happening in the incremental way that children required. First, the concept of moving back to the valley, which he received with a shout that startled the neighbor's dog, and then the concept that Luke Walden would be becoming a significant figure in their lives, which he received with a concentrated 7-second pause and then the question, "Will I still be able to ride Jasper?" "I believe so," Susan said. "Good," Danny said. "I like Jasper." They left Denver on the 4th of November, 1882, on a cold, bright day with a wagon loaded with Susan's books and kitchen things, and the few pieces of furniture that were hers specifically. Alongside Danny's school books and his collection of carved wooden animals, and a tin box of his father's letters that Susan had preserved, because a boy should have his father's words if he wants them someday. The journey south took 2 days again, the same road, the same opening of the landscape from urban pressure to open vastness. But it felt different from the August journey, different in a way that was not about the cold or the bare trees or the sky's particular November gray. It felt different because she was not going toward uncertainty this time. She was going toward something known. Luke met her wagon at the Valley Road. He had ridden out to meet it, which she had not expected, and when she saw him coming toward them on Jasper in the cold morning light, her breath made a small cloud in the air and then dispersed. He rode up beside the wagon and looked at her with the expression she had spent 3 months learning, the expression that was not guarded or performed, just entirely present. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she answered. He dismounted and tied Jasper to the back of the wagon and climbed up onto the seat beside her and took the reins without being asked and drove them down into the valley, which spread out ahead of them in the November light the color of amber and iron, beautiful in the cold austere way that winter light on open land was beautiful. Danny leaned around his mother and said, "Mr. Walden, I practiced the rope in Denver with a fence post in the yard." "I expect you got better," Luke said. "Some," Danny said with honest self-assessment. "Not a lot." "We will fix that," Luke said. They arrived at the ranch house in the mid-morning. Ernesto was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee that he handed to the adults without ceremony, and a glass of milk that he handed to Danny with the grave dignity of a man who has decided to be magnanimous. Colt and the other hands, Bill Garrett included, came out of the barn with the collective expression of people who are pretending not to have been waiting. Susan stepped into the ranch house kitchen, and it smelled of coffee and wood smoke and bread, and she set her traveling bag on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment while Luke came in behind her, and the house adjusted itself around the presence of people filling its rooms. "Guest room," Luke said carefully, "is yours and Danny's for as long as you need it to be the guest room." She turned and looked at him. "That is a very particular way to say something," she said. "I am trying to be respectful of what the situation requires," he said, and there was something in his face that was slightly careful and slightly nervous in a way she had not seen from him before, and it made her love him more, that small visible nervousness from a man who was usually so entirely steady. "Luke," she said, "yes, you wrote me a letter that said come home." "I did. This is home," she said. "I know that. I think you know it too. But there are things we should do in the right order." He smiled at that, a full smile, the kind she had seen only a few times, and that changed his whole face into something even better than the serious face it usually was. "Tell me the right order," he said. "The right order," she said, "is probably first to survive the winter in the same house with reasonable propriety. And then in the spring when the snow comes off the mountains, I think you should talk to Bill Garrett about being away from the ranch for a few days and take me to Durango and speak to the minister there." "That is a reasonable order," Luke said. He took a step toward her and she did not step back. He put his hand against her face with the same careful certainty with which he did everything, and she put her hand over his, and they stood in the kitchen of the ranch house on the first morning of what was going to be their life together, while the Colorado November pressed cold and clear against the windows. He kissed her then, properly and completely, without hurry, the kind of kiss that was not an introduction but a recognition. Ernesto walked in from the porch with the coffee pot, saw them, and walked back out without saying a word. They heard him on the porch saying something quietly to Colt, and then the sound of the hands dispersing with the elaborately casual efficiency of people who have just confirmed something they have been hoping for. The winter was not always easy. Neither was sharing a roof in the careful way they had agreed upon, being in the same house every day with the full weight of what was between them held in patience. There were storms in January that lasted 4 days and kept everyone indoors until the cabin fever was thick enough to cut with a knife. There was a night in February when the cold came so hard that 3 cattle at the north fence were lost, and Luke was out in it until 2 in the morning with the hands, and Susan sat up waiting with coffee on the stove, and felt the specific anxiety of caring deeply about a person whose work required him to be in danger. There was a Thursday in March when Danny caught a bad chest cold, and she and Luke both stayed up with him by turns through a night that was very long, the 2 of them meeting each other at the bedroom door in the gray hours of 4 a.m., with the communicative shorthand of people who have been sharing the daily freight of a household. But there was also the bread on Sunday mornings, and Danny learning to rope properly enough to actually be useful in the smaller corrals, and Bill Garrett's increasingly transparent approval of the whole arrangement, and Ernest producing increasingly elaborate meals on the grounds that, as he put it once with perfect directness, the kitchen had been reorganized into a system he could respect. There were evenings in front of the fire when Susan read and Luke went through his ledgers, and the house was quiet in the way the house was supposed to be quiet, the living quiet of people at rest rather than the empty quiet of absence. There was a particular Saturday in late February when the temperature rose unexpectedly, and the snow began to melt off the southern slopes, and there was a quality of light in the afternoon that promised spring without fully delivering it, and Susan and Luke walked the cottonwood grove by the creek for the first time since November. The trees were bare, but the creek was running clear and fast with the melt water, and they walked along the bank and talked about spring branding, and about Danny's progress with his schooling, and about a letter from Susan's sister in Indiana who had expressed interest in visiting come summer. At some point in the walk, their hands had found each other without either of them making a deliberate event of it, and they walked the rest of the creek bank hand in hand in the thin February sunshine, while the water ran silver beside them, and Luke told her about the trout that came up from the lower river in spring, and she told him about the first spring she could remember from Indiana, the mud and the green, and the particular smell of thawed earth. "I need to tell you something," Luke said as they turned back toward the house. She waited. "I was afraid after Clara," he said. "For a long time I was afraid of this particular kind of thing. Not the ranch, not the work, those felt clean because they were within my control. But this," he moved his hand slightly in hers, a small gesture of indication, "is not within my control. It never is, and the last time I let it be real I lost it." "I know," Susan said. "I am not afraid anymore," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever was in the way of it, it is not in the way anymore." She stopped walking and turned toward him on the creek bank in the pale winter sunshine. "I was married for 12 years to a man who was never entirely present," she said. "I do not mean that unkindly. I mean it as true. And I did not understand until I was standing in your kitchen that first morning watching you make coffee that I had never actually been seen by someone the way you see things." She paused. "I want to be seen like that. I'm ready to be seen like that." He put his arms around her there on the creek bank and held her for a long time with the cold Colorado air around them, and the water running beside them, and the cottonwood trees standing bare and patient in the way of things that know spring is coming. In the last week of March, the snow came fully off the southern slopes, and the valley turned to the deep green of early spring, and Luke spoke to Bill Garrett about the ranch for 4 days, and arranged a trip to Durango. They took Danny and Colt rode along because Bill said someone should, and Colt volunteered immediately with a promptness that suggested he had been prepared for this conversation. The road to Durango was 2 days in good weather, and the weather was cooperative, cold but clear, the mountain views from the road startling in their precision against the blue sky. Durango in 1882 was a proper town of several thousand people, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad having arrived the previous year, and brought with it the commerce and noise of genuine civilization. Susan had been to Durango once before with Harold, a trip for a land commission meeting, and she remembered it as energetic and slightly chaotic. It was all of that and more now, its main street busy with freight wagons and its hotels full with the traffic of the mining operations and the cattle trade. They found rooms at the Strater Hotel, which had opened its doors only the previous year, and was still fresh enough to have a pride in its own quality that the older establishments in the territory had long since settled into comfortable indifference about. Danny was overwhelmed by the carved woodwork of the lobby and spent 10 minutes examining it in silence before Susan could get him upstairs. The next morning, Luke put on the good dark coat that Susan had quietly brushed and pressed the previous evening, and she wore her blue dress, which was the best she had, and they walked to the First Methodist Church on 3rd Avenue with Danny between them and Colt trailing behind with his hat in his hands, and an expression of combined festivity and dignity. The minister was a compact man of perhaps 50 with clear eyes and a handshake that communicated genuine force, and he married them in the church, with the winter light coming through the eastern windows and Danny standing beside Susan, with the concentrated expression of a child who understands the weight of a ceremony, even when he has not been fully briefed on all its implications. Luke said his vows in the same way he said everything that mattered, directly and without ornament, his voice steady, and his eyes on Susan's face with the full attention she had come to understand as the most essential thing about him. She said hers back to him with the same intention, feeling the words as real weight in her mouth, not performance but commitment, the kind that came from knowing exactly what you were choosing and why. Colt cried. He denied it afterward with complete conviction, but his eyes were very red, and Danny offered him a handkerchief with the automatic charity of a child who has been well raised, and Colt accepted it with a dignity that suggested he was grateful nobody was making a significant event of it. They had supper at the hotel that evening, the 4 of them at a round table with candles and the best the kitchen had to offer, which was a proper beef roast and vegetables, and a pie that Danny consumed with the focused commitment of someone who had decided to take full advantage of the occasion. Susan and Luke sat at the table in the candlelight with Colt and Danny talking across them about horses and school, and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad's recent expansion, and she looked at Luke's face in the warm light and thought about the surveying report that had started everything, that small bureaucratic document with Harold's name in the corner, the accidental legacy of a careless man that had somehow, through some improbable grace of consequence, brought her here to this table in this town with this man. She thought, Harold's compartments brought me here. She thought, the world is strange and the ways that good things arrive are rarely the ways you expect. Luke caught her looking at him and raised his glass slightly, just the smallest gesture, the kind meant only for her. She raised hers back. They returned to the ranch on the 4th day to a reception that was not technically a party, but bore all the practical characteristics of one. Ernesto had been cooking since before dawn. Bill Garrett had found somewhere a bottle of brandy that he claimed was for medicinal purposes, but which appeared at supper with no pretense of medical necessity. Even Pearl, the mare, and Jasper seemed to be in an especially agreeable mood, which Danny declared was because they could tell something important had happened. The ranch settled around them in the following weeks with the deep comfort of spring, the kind of renewal that the high country valley performed with annual generosity, the pastures greening and the creek running high, and the cattle spreading out across the expanded feed. Susan and Luke worked the household, and the ranch in the easy collaboration of people who had already spent a winter learning each other's patterns and preferences. She took over the kitchen management in a way that allowed Ernesto to be focused on bunkhouse cooking, which he preferred, with a diplomacy that he acknowledged by producing an excellent tamale for Sunday supper one weekend without being asked, which she understood as a peace offering and received as such. Danny thrived. This was the quietest revolution of that spring and the most important one. The boy who had been somewhat pale and contained in Denver, carrying the weight of his father's death in the particular stoic way of children who have decided not to be a burden, opened in the valley like something that had been waiting for the right soil. He attended the cooperative school 3 days a week, and came home with muddy boots and stories about the other ranch children, and a vocabulary that was expanding daily to include everything he was learning about cattle and horses and the mechanics of frontier life. He developed a genuine friendship with Bill Garrett, who seemed to find the boy's company unexpectedly refreshing and would occasionally allow Danny to accompany him on fence inspection rides with a grave solemnity that Danny reciprocated perfectly. Luke was with Danny the way Luke was with everything that mattered, steadily, attentively, without drama or performance. He did not try to replace Harold. He did not try to make himself into something other than what he was. He was simply present and consistent, which was, Susan had come to understand, exactly what a boy who had lost his father most needed. Not replacement but reliable presence. Not drama but dependability. Danny never called him father. He called him Luke, which was right and natural, and Luke called him Danny and occasionally, in moments of particular pride or affection, son, which Danny received the first time it happened with a stillness that lasted about 4 seconds, and then resolved into a smile that he immediately tried to make look casual and failed completely. Susan saw that. She was in the doorway of the barn when it happened, and she turned back into the yard so neither of them would see her face. And she stood in the spring sunshine with her hand pressed flat against the barn wall, and felt the particular gratitude that arrived in those moments, when life was being exactly what you had hoped it could be. In June, Marcus Webb wrote from Denver to confirm that the Continental Holdings Group's legal challenges had been formally dismissed by the territorial court. The voiding of Harold's claim was complete and official. Luke Walden held the deed to the Walden Ranch without complication or cloud. Marcus enclosed the official court documents along with a brief note in his neat attorney's hand that read, "The matter is fully and permanently resolved. I wish you and yours well." Luke read the letter at the breakfast table and then set it down and sat for a moment looking at it. "It is done," Susan said. "It is done," he said. He folded the letter with care and put it in the desk drawer where he kept the important papers, and then came back to the table and had his coffee, and the conversation moved on to the branding schedule for the following week. But Susan noticed that he sat a little differently for the rest of that day, a slight quality of settled ease that had not been there before, the particular lightness of a man who has been carrying a weight and has finally had it formally and officially removed. That night, lying awake in the stone house with the summer dark warm around them, and the window open to the cottonwood sound and the creek in the distance, she said, "Are you happy, Luke?" He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, she knew that pause now, but considering. He took his time with questions that deserved real answers. "I am happier than I thought I would be again," he said. "After Clara, I had a kind of accommodation with the idea that this ranch was enough, that it was the whole of what I had and I should attend to it and be satisfied." He paused. "I was not suffering, but I was not like this." "Like what?" she asked. "Like a person with a full life," he said. "A person who has something to come in from the pasture for." She moved closer to him in the warm dark. "I want more children," she said. "I should tell you that. Danny should not grow up as an only child if we can help it." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more. "I want that too," he said. "I have wanted that for a long time." "Good," she said. "We agree." The first summer of their marriage passed in the way of good summers, quickly and without the sense of its own passing, until it was almost gone. There were thunderstorms and branding seasons, and a brief excitement when a mountain lion came down to the north pasture and caused a 3-day mobilization of the entire operation before deciding that the valley was more trouble than it was worth and returning to the high country. Susan's sister Alice came from Indiana in July with her husband and their 2 children, and stayed for 2 weeks in a visit that was initially slightly awkward, as Alice had formed strong opinions about Harold Wilcox over 12 years, and was now processing the replacement of those opinions in real time, but which resolved itself by the end of the 2nd week into genuine warmth, particularly between Alice and Bill Garrett, who had a long conversation about Indiana soil that went on for most of a Sunday afternoon and which no one else was able to penetrate. By September, Susan knew she was expecting. She told Luke on a Tuesday evening after supper when Danny had gone to bed, and they were sitting on the porch in the late summer warmth with the valley going purple and gold in the fading light. She had been trying to find the right moment for several days and finally decided there was no right moment, and that a man who valued plain speech deserved plain speech. "I am going to have a baby," she said. Luke turned to look at her, and she watched the thing that happened on his face. The initial stillness, and then the wide-open expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that she had seen only a few times before, and that she thought was the most honest face he had. He pulled her to him without a word and held her on the porch in the last of the September light, and she felt his arms around her and the warmth of the evening and the sound of the creek far below the house, and she thought, this is the life. This exact moment is the thing itself. Is it all right? He said into her hair. Are you well? I am very well, she said. I am excellent. Danny will be enthusiastic, she said. He has already expressed opinions about wanting a younger sibling. He has. He wants someone to teach to rope, she said, and felt Luke laugh against her, the full laugh that she loved best. They told Danny the next morning at breakfast. He sat with the information for approximately 3 seconds and then asked whether it would be a boy or a girl. Susan told him they would not know until spring. He considered this and then said he thought it would be a boy and that he had decided to name him Jim, and that Jim would learn to rope before any of the other children at the cooperative school could rope, which would be an advantage. Luke told him that the baby would be named by his parents. Danny accepted this with some philosophical reservation. The pregnancy moved through the fall and winter in good health, Susan working the household and the kitchen garden until the cold came, and then adapting to the rhythms of the indoor winter with the contentment of a woman who had found her proper location. She was not always comfortable. The cold made her back ache, and the high altitude required adjustment. But she was never frightened, which she thought was the most important thing. She was surrounded by people who paid attention. Luke was so attentive during those months that she had to occasionally ask him to go attend to the ranch, which he did, with the slightly guilty expression of a man caught at something. Ernesto produced weekly a specific soup that he claimed was from a recipe his grandmother had used for pregnant women, and that was in fact extremely good. Danny had taken to checking on her at random intervals, with the focused concern of a boy who had been briefed on the general situation, and was taking his responsibilities seriously. In the deep cold of January, a letter came from Sela's Crane of Continental Holdings. She read it standing at the kitchen table with the fire going and the winter pressing hard against the windows, and her first feeling was a cold spike of alarm that she then deliberated with the patience she had learned. The letter was not a threat. It was a concession dressed in corporate language, formal and slightly grudging, informing Mrs. Walden, he had used the new name, presumably from public record, that Continental Holdings acknowledged the finalized territorial court ruling and would not pursue the matter further. It was signed with Crane's signature and the company seal. She put it in the desk with Marcus Webb's letter and felt the last small piece of the survey document's shadow finally lift. Spring came early in 1883, or at least it announced itself early, the kind of spring that was mostly still winter but had a different smell to it, an anticipation in the air that the valley knew before the thermometer did. The baby came in late March, which was not early spring but was the beginning of the turn, on a cold, bright morning when the creek was running high with snowmelt, and Danny was at school, and Bill Garrett was riding the fences with studied concentration. The baby was a boy. He was large and loud and arrived with every indication of having strong opinions about his entry into the world, which Luke observed with equal amounts of exhausted relief and amusement. Susan held him in the late morning light coming through the bedroom window and felt the ancient, complete weight of him. Luke was sitting on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees, looking at her and the baby with the full attention expression that she had learned to identify as his most fundamental mode of being, the expression that meant he was receiving what was in front of him with his whole capacity for attention. "Hello," she said to the baby. The baby communicated his displeasure at the general situation. "He has thoughts," Luke said. "He has your forehead," Susan said. "He has Harold's ears, I am afraid." Harold had reasonable ears. Harold had very large ears, she said. They are good ears, they just take up a certain proportion of his face. They named the baby Thomas. Thomas Walden. Tommy Within a Week, by Danny's Determination, which stuck as these things do. Danny examined his new brother with the concentrated assessment of a person evaluating something against an established set of criteria and delivered his verdict. He is not Jim, but that is all right. I think I can work with Thomas. The summer of 1883 was the fullest they had known. Tommy grew the way babies grew in the high country, prodigiously, and with an appetite that kept Ernesto's kitchen involved in a steady supporting role. Danny turned 9 in June and received from Luke a proper small saddle fitted for his size and a reliable gray pony named Wick, a gift that produced a speechlessness of approximately 30 seconds followed by a controlled delirium of gratitude that lasted for the rest of the day. Susan planted the kitchen garden large that year and it produced well, and she and Luke spent the early evenings of June and July on the porch after Tommy was asleep, talking in the way they had talked since the beginning, openly and with purpose, because they were people who had both found that honest speech was less costly in the long run than the alternative. Bill Garrett announced in July that he was considering a proposal to a schoolteacher from Durango named Margaret, and would Luke have any objection to a married foreman on the property. Luke told him that there was already a married person prominently installed in the main house, and the ranch had not collapsed, and that Margaret was welcome. Bill appeared to find this observation both fair and slightly insubordinable, which was entirely consistent with his character. Margaret came in August, a sturdy, forthright woman of 30 who had clear eyes and the unsentimental practicality of someone who had been educating frontier children for 8 years and was not surprised by anything. She and Susan became friends within a week, the specific friendship of intelligent women in close proximity who respect each other's intelligence, which was a different and better kind than the social friendships of Denver drawing rooms. On an evening in September, Susan and Luke walked the cottonwood grove by the creek after supper the way they had done since that first February afternoon when the snow was thinking about melting. Tommy was with Ernesto, who was not admitting to anyone how much he enjoyed the baby's company. Danny was with Colt at the corrals, practicing the rope throw that had now become actually useful. The valley was in its September gold, the light coming low and amber through the trees. I keep thinking about the surveying report, Susan said. Luke looked at her. Not about the legal parts of it, she said. About the fact of it. That herald went out to this valley in 1874, 8 years before I arrived, and stood on this land and measured it. That he wrote my name on it in the form of his name, which was mine. That he filed it away and forgot about it. Or kept it, Luke said. Or kept it, she agreed. And that it found me after he was gone and I brought it here. She paused. I cannot decide whether it was the best or worst thing Harold ever did. Luke considered this for a moment in the way he considered everything significant. They walked along the creek bank in the evening light with the cottonwood leaves above them already beginning their autumn turn, gold at the edges. I think it was the most useful thing he ever did, Luke said, without intending it to be. Susan laughed, soft and real. That is very honest. You would not have come without a reason, Luke said. You are not the kind of person who arrives somewhere without a reason. You needed a document. The document needed the right person to carry it honestly. He stopped walking and turned to her. I am glad there was a reason. I am glad you needed a reason to ride into this valley, because without it you would have had no cause to arrive, and I would have continued being a man with a full ranch and an empty house. He paused. I do not know how to be sorry for any of the path that led you here. Susan looked at him standing in the September cottonwood light, this man who had been the unlucky beneficiary of her dead husband's forgotten document, who had gone pale reading a piece of paper that should have unmade him, and then made coffee and fed her son salt bread. This man who had written, "Come home" in a letter and meant it as simply and completely as anything could be meant. Neither do I, she said. He took her face in his hands the way he had that first morning in the kitchen, with the careful certainty that was the whole of his character condensed into gesture. I love you, he said. It was the first time he had said it in exactly those words, and she understood that this was not because he had not felt it, she had known it for months in the architecture of everything he did, but because this was the moment that felt exactly right for plain words. "I love you," she said back to him. "I have loved you since you made coffee without being asked." He laughed and kissed her in the cottonwood grove by the creek in the September evening of their first autumn together as a proper family, and above them, the leaves moved in the cool air like something celebrating. The years settled around the Walden Ranch in the layered way of years well lived, each one adding something and changing something, and leaving its mark on the people who inhabited them. The valley was kind to them, by and large. The cattle operation grew in the careful way of things managed by someone who paid attention and did not overreach, Luke expanding the herd in years when the range supported it and pulling back when it did not, a conservatism that the neighboring ranchers sometimes questioned, and then stopped questioning after the dry summer of 1885 when the overextended operations to the south had trouble and the Walden Ranch did not. Susan had her second child in the spring of 1885, another boy, their second boy named Henry, who arrived even more loudly than Thomas and who, by the age of 2, had already demonstrated a capacity for willful determination that Ernesto said reminded him of certain forces of nature, which he intended as a compliment. Tommy was 2.5 when Henry arrived and dealt with the displacement of his only child status with the philosophical resilience of a child who had Danny to look up to and Luke to model himself on, which was, Susan thought, an excellent set of resources for a boy's character development. Danny grew through those years with the focused purpose of a boy who had found his right place in the world and was busy becoming equal to it. He was 12 when Luke formally taught him to help manage the smaller cattle decisions, and 14 when Bill Garrett began including him in the full operations with the serious attentiveness he brought to everything he considered worth serious attention. Danny was not Luke's blood, but he was, more and more, Luke's kind of person, steady and direct and honest in a way that was considered rather than performed. He kept Harold's tin box of letters. Susan saw it on his shelf sometimes when she passed his room, and she was glad she had packed it from Denver. A boy should know his father's voice even when his father was gone. The having of Harold's voice in those letters did not prevent Danny from being shaped by Luke's presence. It was not a competition. Both things were true, both fathers were real, and Danny was large enough to hold both. On a spring evening in 1886, Susan and Luke sat on the porch after supper with Tommy and Henry asleep inside, and Danny reading by the lamp in the main room, and the valley stretched before them in the late light. The ranch was in good order, the cattle fat on the spring grass, the new fence line on the north side that Luke and Danny had repaired that week standing clean and straight against the ridge. 14 years ago, Susan thought, Harold Wilcox stood in this valley with his surveying equipment and wrote his name on 4,000 acres. He thought he was doing his job. He was doing something else entirely. "Tell me what you are thinking," Luke said beside her. "I am thinking that the world makes more sense than we give it credit for," she said. "Eventually, if you wait long enough and pay attention." Luke set down his coffee cup and took her hand on the porch rail, his thumb tracing the familiar terrain of her fingers. "I think that is exactly right," he said. Down in the cottonwood grove, the creek ran cold and clear from the high ridge, the same water it had run for longer than any human claim or survey could measure. The trees stood in their established patience, the ones Caleb Walden had planted tall enough now to cast real shade, their roots deep in the soil of the valley. A light burned in the ranch house window, the light that belonged to more than one person now, the light that had expanded year by year into something large and warm enough to hold all of them. Susan Wilcox had ridden into the valley with her son and a surveyor's report, and the honest intention of returning something that was not hers to keep. She had not expected to find that what was not hers to keep was the very thing that led her to everything she had ever actually needed. but life in the valley was full of things you did not expect to find. That was, she had come to understand, its particular and most generous gift. She held Luke's hand in the evening on the porch of the ranch house that was now entirely, irrevocably, and in every sense that mattered her home, and listened to the cottonwood sound in the creek below and the comfortable nighttime settling of the place they had built together. And she was, entirely and without complication, at rest.